Okay, so we have 6 biochemically important monosaccharides that could be necessary for the human body. Okay, so we have Glyceraldehyde and dihydroxyacetone. We all know that these are triose, so it has 3 carbon atoms. And eventually, they are intermediates in the process glycolysis. When we say glycolysis, this is the conversion of glucose into pyruvate, 2 atoms or 2 molecules of pyruvate. But before glucose could be converted to pyruvate, intermediates, the diglyceraldehyde and dihydroxyacetone will be produced. So, very important to human body. Next would be D-glucose. So, this is a right-handed molecule because of the D. Okay. And this is the most abundant in nature, and it is used as a primary source of energy. D-glucose is also known as the grape sugar because grapes has 20 to 30% glucose by mass when they are ripe. D-glucose is also known as dextrose if it is in aqueous solution, and it is also known as blood sugar because the normal concentration of glucose in the blood is 70 to 100 milligrams per deciliter. Okay, the glucose concentration varies from the time you had taken the meal, and so it is about 130 milligrams per deciliter in the first hour after eating. So kapag um, habang tumatagal yung oras after you had eaten, bumababa naman siya. Okay, so for those with diabetes, usually they have a high blood glucose level. Okay, so they have high blood glucose level because of the abnormal functioning of hormones which controls the glucose concentration in the blood. So we have 2 hormones that controls them. So insulin, pag mataas ang glucose level, sasabihin ni insulin na okay, glucose mag-form ka into glycogen. And kapag mababa naman yung glucose level sa blood, the hormone glucagon will instruct the glycogen to reform the glucose. Okay? Next would be D-galactose. So kung nakikita nyo, lahat ng important monosaccharides sa human body ay in D form or a right-handed molecule. So D-galactose is seldomly free monosaccharide. So ano ibig sabihin nito? Hindi siya nakapag-iisa. Unlike glucose that it could exist alone as glucose, galactose usually form bonds with other monosaccharides such as glucose so that it could exist. So if galactose is in combination with glucose, mafo-form si lactose. So usually hindi siya free. Galactose is also known as brain sugar because it could be found in the glycoprotein in the brain. Pag sinabing glycoprotein, so you have the glyco, that's the monosaccharide, naka-attach siya sa protein. Okay, so ulitin natin, galactose are not seldomly encountered free. So kailangan niyang makikonnect with other monosaccharide or protein. D-galactose is also very important because they serve as the chemical markers that will distinguish the different blood types. So, discuss natin yan mamaya. Okay? Sa pagdating ng oligosaccharides. So, ma-mention si galactose as an important monosaccharide or part of that different types of blood. Okay, then we have the fructose, also known as levulose. Okay, it is levu means it's the polarimeter rotates on the left. Okay, also other name for the fructose is fruit sugar kasi nga it is the main monosaccharide that could be found in the fruits and honey. Also, it is dietary sugar. It's not because it has fewer calories per gram, but of course, because of its sweetness, human tends to take less of it, such that mas preferred siya in terms of dietary purposes. Okay, we have high fructose corn syrup, which is actually replacing sucrose kasi nga the sucrose is table sugar and it imposes um, negative health effects. So they are making something to replace sucrose to be in a healthier version. Okay, so we have HFCS. This is actually came from the corn syrup and usually it is cheaper than the sucrose that could be obtained from the sugar beets and sugar cane. This is usually used in soft drink industry and in baked goods. And the last important monosaccharide is the ribose, which is eventually found in the genetic molecules DNA and RNA. Kasi nga ito ay ribonucleic acid. The ribo part is eventually the ribose. Also, the ribose is very important for the high energy molecule or compound ATP, which stands for adenosine triphosphate. So for this ATP, meron na namang the ribose molecule sa kanya. Okay? For the reactions of monosaccharides, we have oxidation reaction. Okay, we also have reduction, glycoside formation, phosphate ester formation, and amino sugar formation. Okay, so isa-isahin natin. For the oxidation reaction of monosaccharides, we have three types. Okay, so first is the use of weak oxidizing agents such as toluenes and Benedict solution, wherein the aldehyde end of the aldose will be oxidized to become an aldonic acid. So if we could still recall, an aldehyde end of a monosaccharide, so of an aldose, is usually on the topmost of the Fisher projection formula. So this is an hexose. Okay, so you have polyhydroxy here. Okay, so this end daw, yung kanyang aldehyde end, will be oxidized if there's a weak oxidizing agent. So oxidizing agent usually written in O. Okay, so if that's a weak oxidizing agent, this part of the monosaccharides will be converted or will be oxidized into C double bond OOH. Okay, so the carbonyl group will be oxidized to become a carboxyl group. So the OSE ending of those aldoses will be dropped and will be replaced with O and O onic acid, such that if an aldose is in a form of D-galactose, upon the reaction with weak oxidizing agent, it will then become D-gluconic acid. We drop the Se and D or OSE, and then we add onic acid. Just to denote that such aldose undergo oxidation. So if you have to predict what would be the product if the D-galactose will undergo weak oxidation or oxidation using weak oxidizing agent, it will then become D-galactonic acid. So D-galactonic acid and D-gluconic acid are example of aldonic acid. Ulitin natin, oxidation of monosaccharides will give acidic sugars. This acidic sugar could be aldonic acid. The second type of oxidation is the use of strong oxidizing agent. For this type, it's no longer the aldehyde that is being oxidized, but rather also the primary alcohol or the terminal primary alcohol group of that aldose. So let's recall that an aldose will have an ending of carbonyl group, and then dun sa other end niya is the terminal CH2OH. So kung kanina with the use of weak oxidizing agent, only the carbonyl group as being oxidized to become the carboxyl group COOH, but with the use of strong oxidizing agent, okay, even the terminal end of that aldose will be oxidized to a carboxyl group. So dalawa na dito. Such that ang magiging product dito would be an aldaric acid. Okay? Remember kanina, with the use of weak oxidizing agent, the aldose became an aldonic acid such that may onic acid dun sa dulo ng product. If you're going to use a strong oxidizing agent, the aldose, both ends of that aldose will be oxidized to carboxyl group such that the group formed will be an aldaric acid. Nevertheless, aldaric acid, this aldaric acid and that aldonic acid is still is still acidic sugars. Okay? So the last type of oxidizing agent, before we proceed to that, aldoses, D-glucose with the reaction of strong oxidizing agent will become D-glucaric acid. So the OSE would be dropped and will be replaced with an aric acid. This one is aric acid. So D-glucose will then become D-glucaric acid. And D-galactose will then become D-galactaric acid. Okay? Still, this aldaric acid is an acidic sugar. The last type of oxidation would be the use of enzyme to oxidize, this time just the terminal end of the aldoses. So kung kanina dun sa weak oxidizing agent, ang na-oxidize would be the terminal carbonyl group or the carbonyl group, at ang strong oxidizing agent naman ay both end, the carbonyl group and the primary alcohol. This time, with the use of enzymes, only the terminal primary alcohol end of the aldoses will be oxidized to become a carboxyl group, such that the product would be an alduronic acid. Okay, so let's illustrate. If this is the aldose and it will have a carbonyl group as its functional group on carbon number 1. Okay? So, hindi na ito ngayon ang focus. So, hindi dyan ang ma-oxidize. Rather, this terminal end or the terminal primary alcohol end of the aldoses lang ang mako-convert into COOH or C double bond OH, known as the carboxyl group. Okay, so alduronic acid. So this time the aldehyde end is unoxidized. The D-glucose, with the presence of enzyme as its oxidizing agent, okay, or the one that is responsible for oxidation, will then become the D-glucuronic acid. So this time we are dropping the OSE and we add uronic acid, just to denote that it is under the family of alduronic acid. The galactose, with the presence of enzyme undergoing oxidation reaction, will then become the galacturonic acid. So we could actually identify what type of oxidation happens to a certain aldoses basing on the name of the product. So if it ends again with uronic acid and therefore it is an alduronic acid, then the oxidation happens due to an enzyme. If that is an aldaric acid, meaning it is ending with an aric acid, then therefore it undergoes an oxidation with a strong oxidizing agent. And if that is an aldonic acid having an ending of onic acid, then therefore that aldoses undergo oxidation with an weak oxidizing agent. Nevertheless, this aldonic acid and aldaric acid and alduronic acids, that three are classified to be an acidic sugar. So may tatlo tayong klase ng acidic sugar. Okay? Now, the second reaction is a reduction reaction wherein the monosaccharide in any form, aldose or ketoses, will be converted to sugar alcohol. And this time, the hydroxyl group of the carbonyl group of those monosaccharide will be reduced to hydroxyl. So kung kanina sa oxidation, the carbonyl or the hydroxyl will be oxidized to be a carboxyl group. This time in the reduction, the carbonyl group will be reduced to become hydroxyl. So paano to? The carbonyl group will be oxidized to become, so magiging ganyan na lang siya, OH. So that would be reduced rather. Okay, so an aldose or a ketose with the presence of hydrogen catalyst will produce a polyhydroxy alcohol. Polyhydroxy alcohol na lang siya kasi nga if we could still remember the structure of any aldehyde or sorry of an aldoses, so you have the carbonyl end, and then you have the different OH here. That's why it's called as polyhydroxyaldehyde. And then you have the terminal CH2OH. Once it undergoes reduction, sabi dito, this part, the carbonyl part, the carbonyl part will be converted into hydroxyl. So if that's the case, okay, so matatanggal na itong double bond dyan, and that will be replaced with an hydroxyl. So, paano siya naging polyhydroxy alcohol? Kasi nga, wala ng carbonyl group. Lahat na ay hydroxyl. That's why it's polyhydroxy alcohol. Or more likely known as the sugar alcohol. So, if the glucose will undergo reduction, okay, with the presence of hydrogen catalyst, it will then become glucitol. So the OSE will be replaced by the ITOL. Okay, this glucitol is known as the sorbitol, and that is actually used as a moisturizing agents in foods and cosmetic. Then the sorbitol is also used in toothpaste because sorry, in bubble gum, sweetening agents in bubble gum, such that it is nice that the desorbitol could not be attacked by bacteria because that polyhydroxy alcohol is not a source of food. It's not a food source of those any bacteria that could cause tooth decay. So those bubble gum with desorbitol, aside instead of using sugars, so ayaw siyang kainin ng bacteria. Okay? Kasi it could not synthesize it. Now, however, the desorbitol is also the one that causes the eyes of those patient with diabetes. That desorbitol is actually the source of formation of cataracts. Okay, kaya yung mga diabetics ay meron silang panlalabo ng mata because of the cataract formation. Then the last would be the the third reaction is the glycoside formation. Okay, when you say glycoside, this is actually coming from the reaction of the monosaccharide, which is in cyclic form or that is in Hayward's form, and an alcohol. Of course, this would be in the presence of an acidic condition. The product of this reaction would be glycoside and water. Okay? So, paano ito? Kailangan daw natin dito ng cyclic formation. So, if that would be a Hayward's, so, maalala natin meron tayong OH here. Ang reaction would be with an alcohol. Okay, so the mechanism for the glycoside formation is that the hydroxyl group, this OH, and that RO of the alcohol will be replacing each other such that ang maproproduce dito is the glycoside, okay, with the structure pa rin of the cyclic one. However, for this carbon atom, instead of having an OH, it will going to have an OR because of the replacement of that alcohol. And that OH, magre-react siya naman dun sa H ng alcohol. So, the side product is HOH or more likely that water. Okay? So, this now is the glycoside. Okay? That's the glycoside. And of course, to determine that it's a glycoside, the OSE of the nomenclature of the monosaccharide will be replaced with the suffix "-oside" here so that it could be determined that it undergoes glycoside formation. So if that is the galactose, then therefore reaction with an alcohol, it will become a glucoside plus a side product of water. If that is galactose reacting with an alcohol, then therefore it will then become a galactoside with water. So if the alcohol is methyl, for this case, methyl alcohol, so glucose plus methyl alcohol will produce methyl glucoside. Okay? Nevertheless, the glucoside would be formed from the reaction of monosaccharide with water. With alcohol in an acidic condition. Okay? For phosphate ester would be formed upon the reaction of a glucose or of a monosaccharide with a phosphoric acid. So this is H3PO4. Okay? The phosphate group of that phosphoric acid will attach either on the first or on the second carbon atom of the monosaccharide. So if we're going to have the cyclic form of a monosaccharide. Okay, so this is carbon number 1 and this is, so nandito si carbon number 6. Okay, so usually ganyan siya. Uh, for a for a phosphate ester to be formed, ang mangyayari dito on this site will be replaced with a phosphate group. So that would be glucose 1 phosphate kasi nandito si carbon number 1. However, kapag naman ang phosphate group ay naka-attach sa carbon number 6, so dito naman siya ito naman ang papalitan niya. So that phosphate group will be attached on carbon number 6. That's why we have glucose 6 phosphate. Amino sugar formation naman is the reaction of the monosaccharide wherein one hydroxyl group of that monosaccharide will be replaced by an amino group. Amino group is NH2. So, if kanina the phosphate ester formation happens on the first or on the sixth carbon atom of the monosaccharide, usually the amino sugar formation reaction happens on the second carbon atom. So, okay, so dito usually may O dyan. So if you're going to have an O here, this is the CH2OH, this is the 6 carbon atom. Usually we have carbon atom here, that's carbon number 1, and we have hydroxyl here. Dito sa amino sugar formation, ang nangyayari is napapalitan daw itong hydroxyl dito, usually on the second carbon atom, and that would be replaced by an amino group. So dito ma-attach. Okay, and this one would be the amino sugar. Okay, now we have example here. So glucose will then become glucosamine, so because of the amino group. Galactose will then become galactosamine once it undergo amino sugar formation.